This is TWiET, This Week in Enterprise Tech, episode 568, recorded November 3rd, 2023. Find the gap before you spend. Now it's time for what is consistently the best part of TWiET, and that is our guest. Well, you've already gotten a sneak peek at our guest. Chris Hurd is CEO of Olive Technologies, and he is currently basking in the warmth that is Canada. But we're glad to have him on because we're going to be talking about something that is mentioned a great deal during sales cycles, but tends to get skipped over by a lot of people, and that is the total cost of ownership. Now, don't go rolling your eyes. This isn't one of those boring, drab kind of accounting topics. This is something that's critical because, as anyone who buys technology will tell you, the purchase price only gets you in the game. And that's where your real expenditures start. Add up all of those expenditures and you get to the total cost of ownership. It's going to be a good discussion. Chris, welcome back to TWiET. This isn't your first time with us.
It's actually my first time being on listener, but my first time being on a show. I mean, I was speaking earlier about AI, if that counts. But first time being fully on interviewed by you guys. So I'm really excited to be on with you.
Well, we are very excited to have you. And as with all of our guests, one of the things that we want to know is what your path has been in the industry. I mean, you're currently sitting in that mythical corner office. Was that your first job out of university? What did you do to arrive as CEO?
Oh, wow, that's a lot. And also, I'm not sure I can carry on the trend of best section. I'll try my best, but this may be a first one to break it, but we'll try. Okay, so I won't go all the way back, but I've done a lot of things. I've been a professional poker player. I was a stand-up comedian. I studied marine biology at school. That was always my dream. And then one of my mates said, "Oh, you'll make a bunch of money selling stuff." So I was like, all right, I'll try that out. And then started selling technology. Actually, when I first moved over here, I was in Vancouver, Canada, and started selling mobile web software. And started as a BDR, cold calling. I had experience cold calling for life insurance, so that seemed to work. And sort of worked my way up the pole to a director of sales level. One of the things that I noticed as I started to sell bigger ticket items to companies, there was a lot of bias. Like, my job was essentially to bias people into buying whatever I had because I only had one thing to solve. There's a load of solutions for any given business challenge, but as a salesperson, you only have one. So you're really trained in how to convince people that your solution is the best. It didn't feel great. It wasn't ideal. There were some relationships that went really well, some that didn't go so well. When you incorporate third parties in there as well, there's a lot of third parties that will help CIOs make decisions. And sometimes those third parties have other interests, which can also help sway things. And really what I noticed was that the sales side of the house is equipped with millions of dollars of training in how to sell. Huge sales teams, Super Bowl tickets, you name it. But then also from a software perspective, sales automation. I mean, the sales enablement market is a huge market. On the buy side of the house, outside of procurement, buying really isn't many people's job. It's something that they do as a side gig within the company. There's very little training to IT teams, technical business leaders, in how to evaluate and select technology. And also there's a dearth of software. Like people are on spreadsheets today. Even if you hire the big four to manage some sort of technology evaluation or decision, you're going to end up with a big spreadsheet and a big PowerPoint. And so just that complete imbalance to me stood out as there's a problem we can solve here. Let's jump in and jump into it. The first thing we looked at was sourcing, where RFPs and sourcing seemed to be the biggest pain. So that's where we kicked off, building a platform that can help companies manage RFPs and source. And we've moved on and expanded past there, but that's still the core of the business. And of course, we've got AI, so I'm panicking about all this legislation. We have AI that helps out now. I think that's pretty standard. But yeah, that's it. I mean, from a business standpoint, I talk to you hours about the personal reasons why I'm in Vancouver, Canada, but that's a story for another day, maybe.
Well, it's interesting that you talked about being in sales so often, because that really does begin to get into the TCO question. Because in sales, on the one hand, you're driving to get people to write you a check. These days, what you really want is a subscription, but it's essentially a point solution. And some people will talk about all of the training, all of the deployment costs, all of the configuration costs, all of the cost of not having other solutions in place, and others won't. So when you're talking to people now, do you find that during the sales cycle, are most buyers looking at the transaction cost or the total cost of ownership when they're trying to make a decision on this vast spreadsheet they will have put together?
I think it's difficult, and it's a mixed bag depending on the people. Some people overthink it, right? Some people will overthink it and they'll do, analysis paralysis and never end up making decisions. Some people will say, what's top right of the quadrant? Or who does my mate think is great? So, there's a mixed bag in terms of how much of the TCO is being considered in these decisions. What I think is really interesting about total cost of ownership and us having to do it is, if you think about hiring somebody, when you have a business problem, you can solve them by hiring people, by adding software. There's multiple ways to solve problems. But when you're hiring somebody, you set the rules, right? You know what you're getting in terms of cost. You say, I'm going to pay this much. Maybe I've got some, plus benefits and maybe some bonuses, etc. But you can package that and you're in control of that. It's the other way around when you're looking at software. Right? It's still something that's providing a service for you. It's going to help move your business forward. But the thing that you're hiring is controlling that price and can obfuscate as much as they want to. I think it becomes really, really difficult for decision makers in businesses to understand the TCO, because if you're buying certain software, it's going to be significantly. If you're buying an ERP, for example, it's going to be a very different calculation to if you're even buying an HCM system, which is also large, but the management and implementation costs are not quite as big. And so, are people doing it well? I think it's a mixed bag. One thing I can say that gives me confidence in people spending more time on this, we actually have a TCO module within the application, which is actually one of our highest used portions of our application since we launched it, which is really interesting. But also what we've seen over the last 18 months is that not only are sales cycles getting longer, in actual fact, the negotiation phase of an enterprise deal is now almost twice as long as the legal review from the data that we've worked with. So seeing that is one area you can see people are really, really negotiating a lot longer than they were previously. But also in the last 18 months, we've seen a vast increase in the number of requirements in any decision, and also the number of vendors evaluated in any given decision. So what that says to me is that while yes, it's a mixed bag of whether people are evaluating TCO, I think people are getting more wise to it. And at the very least, they are slowing down and not jumping to buy something based on just, oh, that's how much it costs, let's go for it. It seems like there is a bit more scrutiny happening today than there was 12, 18 months ago.
When you're looking at that scrutiny, when you're talking to companies about that, you've been doing this for a couple of years. And so has the move to the cloud and to software as a service, all of these things where your company doesn't own the hardware platform, and frankly may not own the maintenance of the software. Is that complicating these TCO calculations, or does it, as many people hope, remove them? I don't have anything beyond the cost of the software or service itself. It's absolutely free past that. What are you seeing in terms of these different models of sourcing the functions of software?
Yeah, comparing on-prem to cloud is actually a really interesting one, because it does take away certain elements that you have to evaluate, right? How much is my team going to have to spend managing this and maintaining this, updates, et cetera, et cetera. Some of that is now shifted over to a price increase. I'm sure a lot of people that are listening in here have experienced an annual price increase from almost every vendor. Actually, this year, I'm sure a lot more than historically. So these things didn't happen before, right? You may have updates that you could incorporate, your team would manage it, but the price increase would be less dramatic. So I think that's one thing that's changed with the advent of cloud, but there's a lot more intangibles now. So we talked earlier about data and risk, and the Okta breach, for example. There's a lot of cost associated to those kind of events to a company that you were able to control that security a lot more previously, right? You were able to control your data a lot more. And so that's a kind of intangible piece that you have to incorporate when you're ever looking at TCO, is not just, okay, what's the actual money I'm going to spend here? But then you also have to incorporate, what is the risk, right? So we're talking about security risk. Okay, if there's a data breach, I need to now include that as a potential, the likelihood of that happening, how much that would impact. And now, okay, that needs to really go in there as a hedge. Okay, this may cost me something in the future. There's risk of low adoption, right, that people don't really think about, where a lot of the times it may not deliver the value that you initially wanted it to. That might not be because you chose the wrong software. That might be because you did not train your team well enough on any given application. Then we've got to consider extra training costs. So I think there's definitely been a shift in the total cost of ownership discussion, but it hasn't necessarily, it's not taken things off the table. It's taken one away and added more to it.
Very good. Well, we've got a lot more to discuss on this. Looking forward to it. It's time to continue our conversation. And Brian, I know you've got some questions you've been dying to ask.
Actually, I'm asking Chris to go and take a little bit of a historical view. Just about everyone we've ever had on the show has all said the pandemic made a monstrous change in their industry. And then AI is doing big changes of its own. But we're seeing all these different sea changes. But are we forgetting things? What are the things that people most forget when calculating TCO? And what kinds of things can we do about making sure that doesn't get missed?
That's a great question. And it's interesting. We're talking about AI again. I think that's one of the worst culprits for this, which is ROI. It's not just when you're looking at TCO, now you're looking at it from a purely financial perspective, which is how much is this thing going to cost me? But really, TCO it doesn't exist without ROI. You wouldn't buy something without any value. And I think as much as you can dive into the different elements of the ownership costs, the value that it's going to drive is much less quantifiable, or at least people quantify it a lot less. And so a lot of decisions can be made on, I feel like this should have this impact. And that's where the salesperson comes in, right? Salespeople are trained to paint these beautiful pictures of what the ROI potentially could do, but very few people really analyze it. And I think maybe that's a mentality issue where a lot of people who are evaluating total cost of ownership come from a finance background, or maybe an IT background, but mostly a finance background. So they're very analytical and they want to see every number. A lot of people who are looking at the ROI and trying to position what can this do for the business are looking at it from a business perspective, and it's all about let's go fast, let's go fast, let's go fast. I personally feel that I think during COVID, certain industries like restaurants, for example, actually reacted in a very smart way. And there was a lot of really easily accessible ROI from delivery, even QR menus, etc. It was just really easy to see. AI is the opposite. I think AI, it's almost impossible to understand what the true value of this is going to be to your company until we've figured it out. It seems cool, but ChatGPT seems to help a lot. But I think it's way too early to understand the true ROI of that. So I think people that we all should be taking AI and trying to figure out what it can do for our business, but jumping in and making major, large investments today before we can actually truly analyze the ROI of it, I think it could be a little bit risky.
Well, depending on who you talk to, I've asked TCO questions ever since my career at the federal government, and no matter what, everybody gave me a different answer. Well, my question here is, we have become obsessed with TCO, the entire world, but are we forgetting the human factor?
Dive into that question a little bit more for me, Brian. What specifically are you referring to?
Well, let's use the restaurant industry as an example. If you ask the servers that got laid off, and the printers that lost the business to the QR code, it makes good sense. But are we forgetting that when those printers have payrolls and those servers have kids that they need to send to school? So I guess it's, when we start talking TCO, is the industry also looking at the human factors behind those decisions?
Sadly, I think the answer is no. But I think also, in a weird way, they are really listening to people. For the restaurant industry to stick with the same thing, it wasn't McDonald's or Wendy's that decided that they should have food delivered to people's apartment buildings. People wanted it, right? That's what the customer asked for. People decided that they wanted to spend less time communicating. As soon as they put up something where people can order without talking to a human, they did. And I think that it's important that businesses consider the human element, but they really have to listen to their customers. And that, a lot of the automation that's been driven in most industries, the removal of just general social interaction to being everything digital, there's a responsibility on businesses to make sure they are considering how that impacts society, but there's also an impact there's a responsibility, I feel, on the public as well to push these businesses into building the world that they want. And if the world they want is automatic robot coffee shops, people are going to build automatic robot coffee shops.
Thanks. I will be one of the first to admit that was kind of a touchy question for a lot of industries, but it is a question that a lot of people have been asking. Now, why don't we go in and say, if I'm a CTO, CIO, doesn't matter, I'm a decision maker, and I've watched this episode and it looks kind of interesting. What kinds of things should I sweep up? What kinds of things should I do my homework on before they ring you up?
So as in looking at your technology stack and figuring out, okay, where am I? What should I clean up first?
Yeah. I'm getting ready to go and call you folks up and say, hey, you got some interesting stuff. Tell me more about it. It doesn't do anyone any good if they haven't at least done some introspection first. What kinds of introspection should they be doing before they give you a ring?
Before they give Olive a ring?
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, I think the most important thing that companies don't do very well that they need to do well is combining and aligning IT and business. It's such a challenge. There's been a rise in the CTO and the CIO as a business leader, and they've definitely got a seat at the table, which I think is fantastic. That being said, from my experience, IT is still seen as order takers from business in many cases when we look down to sort of the IT PMO level. And you have the BAs who are there to translate those business needs. I think the number one thing that any company can do before they reach out to Olive or before they embark on any major digital transformation initiative is truly understand all of the current business challenges that the company is facing, rank them, prioritize them, understand those. Use IT to help identify if you already have a solution for those things. That's the number one, because so many companies will go out and buy a new XYZ tool to solve a problem that one of their existing vendors already does. So number one, figure that out. Do we have something that can solve it? And if you don't, then put that as a gap. Okay, now we need to solve that technology gap. Rank those gaps and then go out and look for new solutions. What happens too often is people go to conferences, they get excited, they're like, oh, I've got to get this new thing. And then they end up doing a big evaluation. It either goes nowhere and they waste months or years evaluating something, or even worse, they end up buying something that fails. And every year this stat comes out, 70% of IT implementation fail. It's like BCG does it, Deloitte does it, Gartner says it. It happens across the board. They fail for multiple reasons. One of the biggest reasons they fail is because you never needed that thing in the first place.
I just make a comment. I like that answer. You know, having been a so-called trusted consultant within the federal government, that's actually one of the first questions I ask. You know, it's what are you going to use it for? Do you really need this? And when you're saying that to a 2 or 3 star admiral, you get some really dirty looks.
Luckily, I've never had to say it to an admiral, thankfully.
Yeah. Anyway, hey, it's been a great conversation, and I think our viewers ought to go and check out your offerings at olive.app. I think that's the
one.
That's the one I was given. And it was great having you on the show.
Thanks, gents. It was really good to be here. Yeah, olive.app. We actually have a blog on TCO for enterprise software that was out pretty recent, so you can read through that. It's on olive.app/blog. This has been great. I really enjoyed it, gents.
Thanks for being on.
Well, thanks to Chris for being our guest, and thanks to all of you for being our listeners. As we say so often, we could not and would not do this without you, our listeners.